determination when you still believe that, or your train of thought is still that it means what you want it to mean, not what they want you to want it to mean.
They have to give a reasoned decision or explanation as to how they reach their decision. And if that's irrational, then you argue under the rules of equity to set a new precedent. So going back to yesterday, what Rowan was saying about the judgment being, I'd say wishy-washy, because it says you can't search somebody's property unless you're authorised by Parliament or by the common law. Okay? In essence, that dispute we can resolve by looking at other judgments. So what does the Commissioner of Police of the Metropolis versus Razi 2008 say? Firstly, it's an appeal court case, so it's a high order. What it says is, listen, I don't care if it's an act of Parliament or the common law. You individually have an obligation to make sure your actions that you intend to do are lawful before you do it. So therefore, that resolves that issue. So hence, we always get into finer and finer detail. We start with a generality. An act of Parliament is a generality. That there gets finer detail, more specifics in the secondary legislation. And we'll start with this because you'll see where it comes in legitimate and reasonable options proportionate. And we'll see that there's the impact assessment. And I'll show you how legislation is given the force of law through the first case when it's interpreted in the courts. So an act of Parliament is merely a claim until it's been through the court and there's a judgment, and that judgment now gives it the force of law.
What was the name of that case that you just mentioned?
It's the order following is not lawful excuse. You need to make sure it's lawful. The Metropolis Commissioner of the Police of the Metropolis versus Razi 2008, and that's an appeal court case. Okay, so when you look at the front of a piece of legislation, internet. Legislation. Okay, so what I'm doing is just taking legislation.gov so that you can get to understand a bit how this works. So I just want to spend a few minutes here. So what you've got is, this is their official website where you are publicly noticed, i.e. this is fact, you can't dispute its existence because it's available to the public, okay? And that's what judicial notice means. So when you go to the table of contents of an act or secondary legislation, okay, it's got this thing here called introductory text. And what does the introductory text say to us? Okay, so Control plus. Okay, so it's no different from a title page from a book or a title page from any contract or anything like that. So what it does is it's got a title. This here is basically their filing system, their filing reference. That's the date it was produced. It gives a very quick summary of what it's about. And then this here's the important bit. Be it enacted by the Queen's Most Excellent Majesty, by and with the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal and Commons, in this present Parliament assembled, and by the authority of the same. What have we got there? We've got different parties. The monarch enacts, following the advice and consent of the Lords Spiritual and Temporal. So this is the House of Lords and the House of Commons. under their own authority. Okay? So they are binding themselves through advising and consenting to the duties, rights and obligations contained within that. So where's your name or my name? Nowhere. What's this got to do with me? Nothing. Okay? This document is how one of the procedures that they use to uphold their duties, rights and obligations created in their promise to govern and what they've agreed in the Bill of Rights.
So a good, to let people understand in the room, obviously, it might be worthwhile just having 5 minutes to explain how it is that people fall foul of this and get arrested and go to prison, for instance. Because
Right.
obviously most of us...
Okay. So the Fraud Act, everything comes from the common law. The easiest one is to explain, or an easier one to explain, is the Equality Act. You'll see straight away what it's about. The Equality Act comes out of the common law principle of equal treatment, which means treat like situations in likewise manner, and fairness, i.e. we're all equal under the law and nobody's above the law is what it's saying in the common law. However, what the Equalities Act has done is it's picked certain things which it calls protected characteristics. So, hey man, I can't call you a black dude because that would be discriminating, wouldn't it? Okay? But that's common law because we need to treat everybody equally because we're all equal under the law, nobody's above the law. So what we've got there is a protected characteristic. So basically, if I was to say, hey black dudes, you'd be complaining under the Equality Act, it's a protected characteristic, Mark can't behave like that. But if you call me a honky, that happens to you. Okay? So, other protected characteristics against sex, against religion, about philosophical beliefs.
Discrimination.
But basically, the common law covers any form of discrimination, any inequality, not only the protected characteristics. So what they've done is, in statute law, they have partially codified the common law, but they've not told you what parts of legislation is partially codified common law and what parts is just regulations and administration. That there is where the problem lies. Because at the end of the day, if we look at the Fraud Act, advice and consent equals meeting of the minds and binding myself to the duties, rights and obligations contained within this document. Okay? That there equals common law contract. Yeah, Nick?
By enacting selected parts of the common law, I would call that subverting the Constitution.
Sorry, say again?
By enacting certain parts, selected parts of the common law like that and presenting that as the law,
Yeah?
I would call that subverting the Constitution.
Correct. Yeah, it's fraud. It's fraudulent misrepresentation what they do. Okay, so if we look at the Fraud Act, basically what they're saying is these are specific types of fraud which you can make a complaint, you lay the information, and these are indictable offences. So fraud by false representation, fraud by failing to disclose information, fraud by abuse of process. You need to prove if you're using the Fraud Act, at whose expense or for whose benefit is the fraud about, or who's affected by the fraud. And then they've got part 13, is it? No, 11, obtaining services dishonestly. Okay, so these here are only particular types of fraud that it's codified. What is fraud? Any crime against the mind, end of, nothing else. Yannick?
I was going to answer your question, what it's called.
You agree, anything against the mind?
The
Okay.
definition I know is pretending something is something which is not,
Yeah, which is a crime against the mind.
in order to gain financial or to make something else
Yeah.
financial.
So when you, so sorry, I'm going to talk about
No.
when you had Boris Johnson
Yeah,
in front of the cameras in
Yeah.
regards to the Coronavirus Act,
Yeah.
and he would say to people, you need to adhere to this guidance, because that's what it was guidance, you know?
yeah.
So he said, you must adhere to this guidance, blah, blah, blah.
Fraudulent
And he kept on
misrepresentation.
talking about guidance, and then at the end of that, he would say, if you don't follow this guidance, and I'm sure you all agree, you're breaking the law.
Yeah, okay, that's fraudulent misrepresentation. We need to hold them to account for that. The same thing with newspapers, okay? When they put up the death numbers, that's fraud, okay? When they claim case numbers, that's fraud, because it was fraudulent misrepresentation, okay? Let's go back to natural law. He who doesn't stand on their rights has none. Done. Who's to blame? Us. Why? Because we didn't stand on our rights and stop this nonsense. Okay? Right, now what's important on here is this part here on above. Table of contents, content, explanatory notes, and more resources. Okay? So if we click on to more resources, what have we got here? Okay, let's put my glasses on so I can see. Oops, put it off. Okay. There, an impact assessment. Okay?
The English one.
I know, it's totally on the screen, okay? Impact assessment. There are no associated impact assessments for this legislation. The other thing is, list of changes which affect this. Now, you've got two categories. Things which affect the Fraud Act, i.e. any subsequent legislation that's enacted, which overrules what's in here, and things in here which affect other acts prior to it, okay? And what you'll see is when there's updates to be applied, so let's just go, there may or may not be anything here. So let's just go fraud by false representation. Okay? Changes over time. Right, there you go. Changes to the legislation. Okay? What's it saying? There are currently no known outstanding effects. I.e., this is up to date as it gets. Okay? Now the problem is, with secondary legislation, there is nothing that updates secondary legislation. So secondary legislation, you've got to go through changes. So let's just look at the admin, council tax admin and council tax admin and oh no, hang on, I can't do that here, I've got to put it in properly here. Council tax administration and enforcement. Okay, now there's a drop-down menu here, and this tells us all the different types of legislation. So, primary legislation includes UK Public General Acts, local acts, private and personal acts, acts of the Scottish Parliament, Welsh, blah blah, National Assembly of Wales, blah blah, church measures, acts of the Northern Ireland Assembly, acts of the Scottish Parliament, acts of the English Parliament, Kerry, stop it. Acts of the English Parliament, acts of the Parliament of Great Britain, local acts of the Parliament of Great Britain, personal, private and personal acts, blah, blah, blah. So all of those things are primary legislation. Then you've got secondary legislation, UK statutory instruments, Welsh statutory instruments, blah, 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 a whole long list of what they call, and then you've got EU legislation, and then you've got draft legislation. Okay, so we can search for council tax admin and enforcement. We know it's secondary legislation. Kerry?
So let her out.
Yeah, please. Thanks, then. Okay, we know it's secondary legislation. And we search for it. 1992 I want.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
1992.
Yes,
You can't be
Okay, so, oops, up there. So here it is, okay? So the first thing we need to do is check the relationships, authority. And where we're going to find that in the introductory text. So what gives this power to act? What gives this authority? And it tells us, whoops, proper word from mouse.
Now, if people are kind of asking at the moment, it's difficult to go through and try, you know, obviously you're quite diligent and you go through, do your due diligence in terms of finding information. So
Yeah.
I'll just help people in the room that if you go on this website, on the right hand side when you're searching, if you're looking for something, you can search specific words in specific legislation in the advanced search tab. So when you go to the advanced search tab, yeah, and you type in what you want to look for, you know, like attestation, oath, whatever you want, it'll come up, and then on the left-hand side, when it comes up with all the search results, on the left-hand side, you go to UK General Public Acts.
Yeah, we'll look at that in a minute.
Yeah, so it's just very good
Yeah.
to know, because that's how you find this kind of stuff.
Okay, so basically, the Admin and Enforcement Regulations claims its authority from conferred powers from the Local Government Finance Act. This is what the Local Government Finance Act gives the Council Tax Admin Enforcement Regulations the legal authority, okay? But when we start to look into this now and look at more resources, okay? And where we were, it basically gave you no updates. So, list of changes. So let's just have a look at the list of changes since 1992 that affect the Council Tax Admin and Enforcement Regulations. Okay, which page do you want to start on?
Correct.
Okay?
So every time someone wins, they change something.
Okay, and there's 7 pages of this. You've got to go through all of that to determine what is the current state of the Council Tax Admin and Enforcement Regulations.
So
Okay.
the responsibility is on us, not for them, us to find, not for them to disclose to us.
unreasonable.
It is unreasonable.
Yeah.
So I can't be held to any of this nonsense. Okay? And so to show you the extent of the problem that there is, if we just go to
Yeah.
right. So you see on the left here, unfortunately I can't move the screen over. Basically legislation type. UK statutory instruments, I've got to read the numbers off because they don't all appear there. So the first one is UK statutory instruments, there's 83,492 pieces of paper. Or, sorry, not pieces of paper, documents which affect secondary, which affect you. UK local acts 20,000, Northern Ireland Act 17,000. Now, Northern Ireland, you have something called the jurisdiction. Remember what we said, jurisdiction is the power to act. So, so the Northern Ireland stuff's got nothing to do with England. It's specific to Northern Ireland. The Scottish stuff is specific to Scotland. Okay? But the general public, the general acts, okay, so this one here, general acts, 4,549 affect everybody in the UK. On top of that, in England, you've got Acts of the Parliament of Great Britain, 273 pieces, and on top of that, you've got the Act 79 pieces of old from the English Parliament. So you're talking about like 4,500 pieces of primary legislation. You can't even bloody read that in a lifetime, let alone even vaguely comprehend it. What's the criteria of law? What should law be?
Simple, understandable.
Simple, understandable, accessible.
Common.
Okay? So therefore, from that alone, this is utter crap. It's not law. Okay? Yeah, no?
If it's being done deliberately, avoiding the course of justice.
We can debate about that, but another place. What I want to do, though, is take you to this part. Oh shit, they moved that to now. They keep on moving stuff around. Home.
In order to make it more intelligible.
So, search the changes.
Understanding legislation, how legislation works. We're looking for proof that legislation doesn't apply to us, that it's not law. Okay? There's this section here called how legislation works. What it does is it goes through and explains what is primary legislation, what is secondary legislation. Summed up, primary legislation is an act of Parliament. Remember when we went back yesterday? Okay? Parliament makes an act and that authorises Her Majesty's government to act and confers powers, it delegates authority for them to micromanage, fill in the details. Parliament is macromanager, board of directors or CEO sort of thing. As
Comment
opposed to
to
manager.
change that first line.
Yeah.
Because obviously primary legislation is the term used to describe the main laws passed by legislature.
Correct. Okay. Right. So, what is law? Remember yesterday we were saying law is the creation of duties, rights and obligations. So, are they're playing with words there, the main laws, but guess what? Those are the laws of Parliament and the government as to how they will deliver their promise to you. So it's binding to them, it's not binding to you. Okay? And they keep on using this stuff interchangeably. So secondary legislation is delegated legislation which gets its authority from primary legislation conferred power. Okay? Goes through the list of them. Then it talks about bylaws, and then it talks about, oh, have we heard of this stuff called case law? Does that sound familiar? Yeah? So, it tells us case law is the set of rulings from court judgments that set precedent, i.e. common law precedent. Now, it's got a fraudulent misrepresentation here for how the law, that should read how legislation, okay, is interpreted and applied in specific cases. So what that's saying is, in the first instance, an act of Parliament or a piece of regulation is a claim. That claim is made by the state against an individual, so party A, party B having a dispute, and once the court has interpreted that and listened to the arguments from the kiddies, that now becomes common law precedent, and that's how legislation gains the force of law. Right? Simple, nothing complicated. And guess what else it says? Case law is not held in legislation.gov. You ain't going to find law here, mate. You've got to go somewhere else to find law. So, going back to, is law accessible? No. So if it's not accessible, how can I be held to account to law? Okay? So, what am I aware of? What is disclosed? Yes, that bit I can be held to account. So, going back to the fundamental principles, if there is not disclosure, okay, if you want to sit and argue the definition of people, person, I really don't give a shit. Because if we're sitting and arguing, there's not been full disclosure, therefore it doesn't apply to me. Argue all you like, you're wasting your time. Okay? So when people start to talk legalese and all of this stuff and make all these claims about the words make a difference and all of that, equity prevails over the common law in the event of a conflict. Therefore, from that, if there's not been a meeting of the minds, what is the substance of it? It's simple. We've got to keep it simple.
But you'd still have to know, wouldn't you? I mean, you'd still have to know that, you know, for instance,
And what you'll see is, when we go onto the duties, rights and obligations of the legal profession, they use the word plain language or something like that. Basically, the legal definition, the legal requirement is, whatever that document is, how would a reasonable person understand it? not a specialist, a reasonable person. So basically, the language they use in courts, if they're not using O-level English, you just object. Sorry, can you explain? Can you explain? Can you explain? Because there's an obligation to make sure that the message is sent and understood as sent. Okay? And we'll cover that when we get into the solicitor's obligations and the legal profession's obligations. Okay, so you're happy that and understand why legislation does not apply to you from the view it only binds those who advised and consented. Yeah? In agreement with that? Anybody with that? Okay? And that there's quite simply a common law contract, and before it can apply to anybody, the courts need to sit between and resolve the dispute between the kiddies. So, what are we relying on, or what am I trying to get across? Simplicity. What authority does Parliament have? By their own admissions. So for that, the first act of William and Mary, that there creates the legal fictions of the two houses. So the one house is the House of Lords, and that includes the Lord's spiritual and Lord's temporal. So the House of the Lords is the two types of Lords, and the House of Commons. So the legal fictions were created. Prior to that, the law died with its creator, which was the king. But now, all of a sudden, we've made fictions, and these fictions don't die. So therefore, you didn't have the reaffirmation of the charters, the cherry picking of the new king of what they want to bring into their reign. Okay, and start their reign with. So the Acts of Parliament are from the fiction created by the actors, living people like you and me. So that's where the fiction is created of the two houses, and the Bill of Rights creates the fiction of Parliament assembled, i.e. the monarch plus the so now we've got all the contracting parties on an Act of Parliament. Yeah.
How does any legislation before 1688 have any effect then? Because it should have died with the king.
Okay, now the reason for that is most of the stuff that is pre-Bill of Rights is actually common law judgments which have been enacted. So no different from, for instance, the Fraud Act. So codified common law, because it's codified common law, it was not created by Parliament. They can unenact it, but the common law still stands. Why? Parliament didn't create the common law, therefore it can't uncreate it. It has no authority over it. Equally, the courts have no authority over Acts of Parliament. All that the courts can say is, that Act of Parliament is unlawful. They can't uncreate it, okay? Because it did not create it.
So sorry, on that, exactly what you talked about.
Yeah.
So on the Public Order Act 1986, when you go in, obviously before it says it be enacted, it says an act to abolish the common law offences of riot, rout, unlawful assembly and affray. Yeah?
Okay.
So what right do they have to put that into? That's
Zero.
Exactly.
They have no authority. They didn't create it, they've got no authority. Why? Because we the people created the common law in the courts.
Which is our customs.
No, we created the law,
Yeah.
and that was just through how we argued it in the court. Now, customs I really want to look into as to what sort of is the definition of customs. But essentially, it's a... Carrie, come here. Yeah? Come on. Lie down. So custom really, I again look at it from the simplicity of what does custom mean in an own level English person, a custom, how do you normally behave sort of thing. So,
So Mark,
yeah,
you know when the Queen died,
yeah.
Prince Charles made a speech, and in this speech he said he intended to rule how the previous monarchs ruled by the Constitution.
Sorry, say again?
He says, I intend to rule how the previous monarchs ruled.
Well, which previous monarchs? Because certainly since the Bill of Rights, okay, the previous monarchs have basically just signed. That's it. Okay.
They haven't ruled
So,
by the Constitution.
I don't know, what does he mean by that? Does he want to go back to retiring kings or something? It doesn't matter. You know, I don't, it really doesn't matter, okay? Because it's up to us to ensure what happens in the future. Okay, now, we talked about this yesterday. The Bill of Rights in its first sentence says what? We the people are the principal of Parliament assembled. They are agents. Principal agent, the agent, so long as they act within authority of the principal, can do nothing to bind the principal without that authority. I.e., in the Bill of Rights they say, we, the agents of you guys, the people, we cannot do anything to your prejudice. Why? All are equal under the law, nobody is above the law. They can't bind you, simple principal agency. So that's in their first sentence, the admission that we tell them what to do, and one of the ways that we tell them to do something is what's called the unwritten constitution, and the unwritten constitution are constraints we put on those governing when we settle cases in the court. Okay? So that's how we create law which should be constraining the acts, their authority, on top of what they've already declared themselves that they can't do anything to our prejudice.
So when you say, like you just said, customs, yeah?
Yeah.
See, when you go into etymology online, customs stems from the word mors in Latin, which means associated with or characterized by the right behavior, also associated with or concerning conduct or moral principles. So that to me makes a lot of sense.
I mean, the problem with morals is they change over time. And
Because
it's
if all this is
preconditions.
associated to the Bible, which ultimately it is, because it's linked to the King James Bible, because that's where all of this stems from, then ultimately our morals come from the Ten Commandments. So that's where your customs would come from. Because being a Christian country, our morals are determined by that book.
We've all grown beyond that, okay? That's just hearsay evidence, okay? We've grown beyond that, and the rules of equity better define guiding principles of morality, the conscience, right and wrong. So we've already evolved over the Bible.
You're correct, but however, at the moment, that's the only written word of God we have. So until the
It's
Creator
not.
comes
It's
down and
hearsay
says,
evidence. It's hearsay evidence. Bring God here to tell me
But that's what I'm
he
saying
said
to you.
that.
That's what I'm saying to you. Bring God in, but you as well. You're saying bring God here.
Yeah.
Well,
Well,
what
if you're
evidence do
claiming
you-
that, if
but
you
what evidence do you have to contrary to the fact that God came and gave someone evidence in the first place?
you making a claim, mate, try it. He who claims must prove. I'm not interested in. You're the one that's claiming it.
You could have said God spoke to you last night and told us all.
No.
Yeah, but
I'm just saying
that's not
that's where
God's.
they get their
Yeah, I
moral
understand
principles
that, but
from.
before-
That is not God's evidence. That's his interpretation of God's evidence of what was
Before
Right,
the
spoken.
that is
Ten
true, this is
Commandments.
absolutely true. But you saying that the customs change with the times,
Yeah,
to me sounds really dangerous, because if the trans
correct.
movement,
Correct. That's why, to me, it's about law. I don't give a shit about custom. It's about law, truth. The highest unrebutted claim stands as truth, and that is the law.
and yet we are governed according to our customs, which is...
No, we govern
Yes.
according to our laws
And-
and our customs.
and our customs.
Okay?
But what are our customs?
I don't know.
Beliefs.
We all got different
Our
customs.
brainwashed beliefs.
It's a big word, isn't it?
Yeah, but they're, so what do they mean?